Since his mother was distantly related to the royal Princess de Condé, she served as her lady-in-waiting, meaning he was born in the luxurious Hôtel de Condé in Paris. His father, the Count de Sade, got to enjoy the fruits of his wife's labor and live in one of the most extravagant palaces in all of France. When de Sade was just a boy, his father abandoned the family. Not long after that, his mother joined a convent, leaving the young child all alone in the Hôtel de Condé. The servants spoiled the young boy rotten. They indulged his every fantasy, never saying no. Young Donatien wasn't the only boy running around the halls of the palace. Louis-Joseph de Bourbon, the Prince of Condé and a close relative of the king, was around his age. De Sade's caretakers made the two boys playmates, hoping to instill a lifelong friendship that could help de Sade later in life. They underestimated one thing, though. At any age, the Marquis de Sade did not play well with others. One day, he and the prince had a disagreement. The prince assumed that as the more important of the two, de Sade should defer to him. Prince or no, young Donatien was used to getting his way, and when he threw a tantrum, he really threw a tantrum. He pounced on the prince and viciously beat him to within an inch of his life, until servants finally arrived on the scene and tore him off. De Sade left the prince in such a sickening state that his attendants worried he might never recover. As he grew older, the Marquis de Sade only grew more and more deranged. With no parents in the picture, his uncle, the Abbé de Sade, did his best to educate the boy, but when he came of age, it was time for de Sade to go to a real school. His uncle sent him to the famed Lycée Louis-le-Grand, a prestigious secondary school in Paris that still exists to this day. The Marquis de Sade was in for a rude awakening when he arrived at the school. As a boy, sycophantic servants had succumbed to his every whim, but school was a different story. When students stepped out of line, something he did a lot, the punishment was severe. Serious infractions, administrators subjected students to flagellation. While being whipped was a pretty good deterrent for most students, for the Marquis de Sade, it had the opposite effect. The young libertine became obsessed with the act, and it would become a staple of his deviant behavior later in life. Little did those teachers know, all that whipping was creating a monster. When it came time to find a wife, the Marquis de Sade married Lady Montreuil in 1763. A lady and a marquis married at the height of French aristocratic opulence. It seems like a fairy tale, but it was actually a horror story. The Marquis de Sade's marriage produced 2 sons and a daughter, but his heart wasn't really in the family life. In the years that followed his marriage, de Sade lived mostly in Paris, where he started to indulge in his deviant fantasies. He made a name for himself with his libertine lifestyle and obscene hobbies. He became so infamous that the local authorities put him under surveillance, keeping close tabs on his activities. His behavior got him imprisoned for several short stints until the Parisians finally got fed up with him. They exiled him to his castle in Lacoste and washed their hands of him. Of course, that wasn't the last they'd hear of the Marquis de Sade. Our boy's adult life truly began in 1767 when his father died. His dad had gone by the Count de Sade, but Donatien decided he liked the sound of Marquis better. The spoiled, quick-tempered boy was now a spoiled, sadistic man, and behind the walls of the Château de Lacoste, the Marquis de Sade began experimenting with his wildest desires. He hired only the most attractive young men and women to work in his castle, and forced them into his salacious bedroom activities. Eventually, he went too far. He forced one woman to include a crucifix in their bedroom games, and she was horrified. She fled the castle after and went straight to the authorities. They stormed the castle, clapped de Sade in chains, and charged him with blasphemy, an extremely serious offense at the time. As the years went by, the Marquis de Sade's actions grew more and more disturbing. In 1768, he found himself in chains yet again. One of his chambermaids managed to escape and get to the authorities. The tale she told them was harrowing. forced imprisonment, whips, knives, and candle wax, the whole shebang. In 1772, he and his manservant Latour were convicted of sodomy with 4 women, and in the 18th century, the sentence for sodomy was death. For the first time, at least in the eyes of the law, the Marquis de Sade had truly gone too far, and now he had to flee for his life. De Sade and Latour ran away to Italy 1 step ahead of the authorities. The outlaws couldn't evade the law for long, and soon enough, de Sade found himself behind bars yet again, this time at the fortress of Mialon in French Savoy. The Marquis de Sade was a slippery one, and he and Latour managed to escape after 4 months' imprisonment. They secretly made their way back to Lacoste, where de Sade reunited with his wife. Wild debauchery erupted at the Château de Lacoste once more, and if you think his wife was simply a beleaguered bystander in all of this, think again. The Lady de Sade was very much an active participant in her husband's endeavors. You'd think having capital punishment hanging over his head would make the Marquis de Sade slow down. It didn't. He and his wife's next misadventure involved imprisoning 5 women and a man for 6 full weeks. There's hedonism, and then there's, well, this. Since kidnapping and imprisonment was definitely against the law, de Sade found himself on the run once more. Back to Italy he went, but the Marquis de Sade just couldn't stay away from his sordid pleasure palace for long. The Château de Lacoste was the Marquis de Sade's happy place. He returned from Italy yet again in 1776. After the better part of a decade evading consequences for his actions, he probably felt invincible, but his number was about to come up. He got news that his mother was deathly ill and wished to see him one last time before the end. De Sade, who hadn't seen his mum since he was a child, packed his bags and headed to Paris. He was completely unaware that he was walking into a trap. In the end, it took a cruel trick to catch the Marquis de Sade, though it's hard to say he didn't deserve it. The letter from his mother had been a ruse. In reality, she had died much earlier without a single word sent to her delinquent son. As soon as de Sade arrived in Paris, the authorities captured him once again. He'd been imprisoned lots of times before, but this was different. At the very least, de Sade managed to successfully appeal his execution order in 1778. However, while that should have meant he was free to return to Lacoste and get back to his disturbing hobbies, this wasn't the case. When she heard news of his appeal, de Sade's mother-in-law, Madame de Montreuil, personally wrote to King Louis XVI asking that de Sade stay imprisoned. He might have earned his freedom if he'd simply expressed remorse for his actions, but that was the one thing the hedonistic Marquis simply refused to do. He wrote to his wife in 1783, right in the middle of what would end up being an 11-year imprisonment. "Either kill me or take me like this, for I will not change." After being passed around various fortresses, de Sade ended up at Paris' infamous Bastille. And this is when he wrote his magnum opus, The 120 Days of Sodom. And if you want to know what it's about, you can look it up. Let's just say it's exactly what you'd expect. Obviously, if one of his guards found what he was writing, he'd be in serious trouble. From his imprisonment, de Sade managed to procure an extremely long, continuous roll of paper. He wrote in tiny handwriting on the long scroll to fit the entire book on a single page. Whenever guards were around, he tightly rolled up the paper and hid it in a crack in the wall. This scheme worked for a time, but then, in 1789, disaster struck. He finally got himself out of his cell, but not in the way he'd planned. He incited unrest outside of the fortress by shouting to a crowd below his window that prisoners were being killed. Fed up, guards dragged him out of his cell and hauled him off to the insane asylum at Charenton. They took him so quickly he couldn't get his manuscript out of the walls, leaving it unfinished. Something else significant happened in 1789. A mere 10 days after de Sade left, the storming of the Bastille occurred, and the French Revolution kicked off. Seeing how the revolutionaries felt about aristocrats, it's probably a good thing the Marquis wasn't around. When he heard about the storming of the Bastille, he despaired, assuming that his manuscript would be destroyed. What he didn't know was that a man named Arnaud de Saint-Maximin had discovered the scroll in the wall of de Sade's cell and taken it away from the fortress 2 days before the revolutionaries took over. The changing tides in France meant that the Marquis de Sade was about to get a second chance at life. In 1790, without the king's authority to keep him in prison, the Marquis de Sade was free. The world had changed in those 11 years. For one thing, his wife finally got fed up and divorced him. Revolutionaries had also sacked his beloved Château de la Coste, so he had to move to Paris once more. But the biggest change, obviously, was the revolution. Noblemen like de Sade had a target on their backs, and the Marquis had to play his cards very carefully if he didn't want to end up underneath the blade of a guillotine. Like many paranoid aristocrats, the Marquis decided he needed a rebrand. Goodbye, Marquis de Sade. Hello, Citizen Sade. He supported the Republic and actually managed to land several official positions in the new government, even with his noble roots. For a time, it seemed like the Marquis de Sade was becoming downright boring. He worked as a government official. He shacked up with Marie Constance Ken, a one-time actress with a 6-year-old son, and he mostly laid low, but he couldn't completely give up his vulgarity. He kept writing his depraved novels and began publishing them anonymously. As the Reign of Terror began, de Sade became more and more critical of the new regime, specifically of the ruthless Maximilien Robespierre. As a result, the authorities removed him from his posts and threw him back behind bars for almost a year. By 1796, de Sade was completely destitute. He even had to sell his beloved Château de la Coste, now a ruined shell of its former glory. Moving back to Paris, he eked out a humble existence. He released 2 of his most widely read books, Justine and Juliet, and like all his other works, they shocked readers. Unfortunately for de Sade, one of those readers was Napoleon Bonaparte, and he wasn't about to let the author of such scandalous books roam free. In 1801, Napoleon demanded that the authorities track down whoever had written that filth. The Marquis de Sade was already infamous for his activities and his writing, so it didn't take long to track him down and lock him up yet again. Following reports that de Sade was seducing young prisoners, because of course he was, Napoleon had him transferred to the nightmarish Bicêtre asylum. De Sade's family managed to get him declared insane and transferred to the asylum at Charenton, where he'd been imprisoned many years earlier. Here he received much more lenient treatment. He even managed to convince the authorities that his lover Marie Constance was his relative, so they allowed her to live there with him. After what he'd been through, this was basically a vacation for the Marquis de Sade, though he couldn't help but get in trouble anyway. Charenton's director, Abbé de Comier, was remarkably progressive for the time. He encouraged de Sade's writing as a form of therapy, and even allowed him to stage several of his plays for the Parisian public, using other patients as the actors. De Sade's plays were exactly as obscene as you'd think, and it was only a matter of time before the authorities nipped them in the bud. They demanded that Comier place de Sade in solitary confinement and deprived him of pen and paper. In his final years, while still with Constance, the Marquis de Sade began an intimate relationship with the 14-year-old Madeleine Leclerc, the daughter of a Charenton employee. Their trust lasted for 4 years, but finally, after 7 decades of sadism, debauchery, and deviance, the Marquis de Sade's number was finally up. He died on December 2, 1814, at the age of 74. When all was said and done, the Marquis de Sade spent almost 29 years imprisoned in various fortresses and insane asylums across France. Though many of his works survive, there are entire troves of de Sade's writing that are lost to history, all thanks to his son's cruel betrayal. As you can imagine, the Marquis wasn't a great father, and his son deeply resented him. As soon as de Sade was gone, his son burned all of his remaining unpublished manuscripts to avoid further embarrassment to the family name. And with that, the Marquis de Sade was gone. His family did everything in their power to erase him from history and move on as if he had never existed, and they nearly succeeded. He remained almost completely unknown for over a century thanks to his family's suppression efforts. The few works of his that remained were all locked up in the infamous section of the National Library in Paris, known as Unfair or Hell. However, in the mid-20th century, one of his descendants, Xavier de Sade, took an interest in his disgraced ancestor. Xavier had never even heard of the Marquis until the 1940s, when he started researching and uncovered a store of de Sade's papers at the family chateau. He worked with scholars to have these papers published, and he worked tirelessly for the rest of his life to ensure that the world knew the Marquis de Sade. Thanks largely to the efforts of his family, the Marquis de Sade is well known today. The family continues to capitalize on his legend, owning a trademark on his name, a line of luxury goods called Maison de Sade, and even a Sade winery with the Marquis signature on their bottles. For the horrors he committed on his unconsenting servants, the Marquis de Sade got off pretty easy, but he very nearly met a painful end years earlier. One of the servants who fled his castle in his heady ran to her family and told them what the Marquis did to her. Her father, understandably, was horrified and furious. The authorities had proved incapable of stopping de Sade thus far, so he decided to take matters into his own hands. He traveled to Lacoste with one thing on his mind: vengeance. The Marquis de Sade was a lot of things: cruel, sadistic, depraved, and lucky. When his employee's father came to Lacoste, he brought a loaded pistol and a bullet for de Sade's heart. The man got within arm's reach of the Marquis, drew his weapon and fired, but it misfired, saving de Sade's life. Once again, it seemed as though he was being watched over by a guardian angel, or a demon. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more videos. Thanks for watching.